In October 2020, Habbo, a virtual world for teenagers and young adults, announced that it was releasing a new update called Habbo 2020. As Adobe Flash, the underlying engine of the game, was being discontinued, the Habbo 2020 update promised to transition Habbo into a new Unity client. Habbo's resources, however, were stretched thin, so not all of the features in the Flash client would be present in the new update. The introduction of two-factor authentication, for example, had to be postponed indefinitely until they were able to fix quote-unquote more pressing issues. Instead, Habbo was going to use that time to implement some new changes to the game. For the first time in Habbo's history, players would be able to consistently earn credits, Habbo's premium currency, through completing quests. To deter gold farming, these credits would be stored away in a newly introduced feature, the Vault. If a player wished to spend these locked credits, they had to pay an 80% withdrawal tax first. Credits earned through quests weren't the only ones that would be stored away in the Vault. Any player with a balance of 500 credits or more would have their newly acquired surplus credits stored in the Vault. Or to put it another way, it was an 80% wealth tax. But Habbo didn't stop there, because they began making a series of rapid-fire announcements detailing a litany of upcoming changes, a 400% increase in exchange tax, a nearly 6,000% increase in sales tax, a new $100 a year tax on custom-built rooms, a 5-credit tax to permanently send your pet on a holiday. As news of Habbo's plans filtered through to the general public, the markets began to panic. Users offloaded tens of thousands of dollars worth of virtual assets in fire sales as the value of rare items, virtual currency, and entire accounts plummeted overnight. Between May 2020 and January 2021, the gold bar, a currency item worth 50 credits, dropped around 65% in value in the black market. On the last day of the Flash client's operation, a player was reportedly trying to sell their thrones, the gold standard of rare items, for 50 credits, around $1.25 at contemporary rates, a 97% drop from its previous $48 valuation in May 2020. The market crash led to a full-blown economic crisis as spending in the economy ground to a halt. In August 2020, Habbo Club members, players subscribed to its premium membership, spent an estimated $13.1 million in black market rates on goods and services. Just 6 months later, that figure dropped to an estimated $2.7 million, a nearly 80% drop. In total, it's estimated that the market crash wiped out over $30 million, entirely eliminating Habbo's economic growth during the pandemic. As the economy of Habbo came crashing down, players began throwing decades of friendship under the bus by scamming each other to cover their losses. Tens of thousands of dollars were stolen in a crime wave of casino, cryptocurrency, and black market scams that ruined the reputations of some and the livelihoods of many. So this is the story of Habbo 2020 and how it caused what was possibly the worst market crash in its over 2-decade history. It was early October when a Brazilian player named Patty reported a bug she encountered in the game. She was making a room for the upcoming Halloween celebrations when she noticed her room was seemingly shadow banned. For context, when players create their own rooms on Habbo, their rooms show up on the Navigator, a tool which displays active rooms that other players can travel to. The issue was that Patty's room didn't show up in it. Patty created her room using Habbo's Builders Club, a premium club whose membership cost $112 a year. For that price, users were given the ability to rent furniture to decorate their rooms with, and the ability to create custom architectural designs for their rooms. While rented furniture had to be returned back after a person's membership expired, custom architectures that users created remained, even after expiry. Also, that was the case until October 2020. As it transpired, the developers of Habbo were experimenting with a change that would shadow ban any rooms that had custom architecture. While they were testing the feature, they accidentally deployed it to the entire game, but instead of reversing it, Habbo issued a press release stating that, while these changes were made ahead of schedule and without warning, they're here to stay. Habbo U-turned on their decision 2 days later, apologising for the lack of notice they gave in making the change. But they were also insistent that once Habbo 2020 was released, rooms that were edited using Builders Club would be locked for all visitors, unless, of course, their owners renewed their Builders Club membership. 3 days later, Habbo announced its Vault feature with its de facto 80% wealth tax. However, players had an option to avoid the tax. By paying Habbo a fixed fee of $6, players could unlock their vaults, thereby receiving a permanent tax exemption. The wealth tax, however, wasn't the only thing announced that day. Buried deep in the article was a small addendum stating that the exchange tax was to be increased with immediate effect to, quote-unquote, ensure a smooth transfer to the new system. Credits in a player's purse are illiquid and can't be used in user-to-user trade. If someone wanted to trade their credits with another person, they would have to convert it into physical tradable currency first. The exchange tax was a levy charged by Habbo to convert a player's credits into tradable currency, and it was previously fixed at 1 credit. In other words, to trade 50 credits using a gold bar, a player had to pay a 1 credit levy, making the exchange tax effectively a 2% tax for high-value trades. Habbo, without giving any prior notice, raised the levy to 10%, effectively increasing the exchange tax by 400%. But Habbo still wasn't done, because on the same day they announced they were making changes to the Habbo Club gifts. Previously, Habbo Club members were given a point for every month of membership, which they could use to redeem for any gifts they wanted. The gift selection changed every year, and if players didn't like the gifts on offer, they could save up their points and wait for the next collection. The issue was that 2020 would see no new collection. Habbo announced that it was going to wipe out everyone's points for the update, and urged every Habbo Club member to redeem all of the points they currently had. And what was the gift selection on offer? 12 floating, unwearable masks. One user made their displeasure known by taking a screenshot of their annoyed avatar holding a skull emoji sign next to the nearly 90 masks they bought. Another user inquired, "Well, can we have some good stuff to exchange them for? I didn't want 60 masks when they were released, and I sure as hell don't want them now." One player simply replied, 114 points. If you're wondering, that's 9.5 years worth of points. In November 2020, Habbo announced a change to the marketplace, an in-game store run by Habbo themselves that allowed players to sell their items without being physically present in user-run stores. Specifically, it was introducing a 10% operation fee, charging sellers upfront for listing their items in the marketplace. If an item didn't sell within 48 hours, then the seller took the loss, and according to Habbo, that was a sign that the seller should have set a quote, fairer price. When it became clear that the operation fee would obliterate the marketplace, as no rational seller would ever pay a non-refundable fee to use it, Habbo U-turned and announced it was abolishing the operation fee. Instead, it would increase the existing sales tax, which was at 1%, to a progressive sales tax between 10 to 60%. In other words, for the highest valued items, Habbo was increasing the sales tax by nearly 6,000%. By raising the sales tax that high, there was a risk that players would avoid using the marketplace in favour of user-to-user trade. So Habbo thought one step ahead. It was going to make the new sales tax mandatory, and it was going to do that by abolishing user-to-user trade entirely, a game feature responsible for moving $500 million worth of virtual currency and assets every year, according to Habbo themselves in 2010. Private shop owners weren't the only ones screwed by the abolition of trading. As trading was also used to give out items and coins away, fan sites and charities could no longer give out free prizes. Corporations would go bankrupt as employees would be unable to pay the salaries of their employers, and yes, I phrased that correctly. In response to these concerns, Habbo announced it was introducing a credit donation tool in lieu of trading. Players, by paying a donation tax of 1 credit, would be able to donate up to 9 credits at a time to another player. When the fan site Habbo crunched the figures, it found that the over $6,500 it was spending every year on charitable events would incur an additional donation tax of $1,400. While Habbo was busy ramming new taxes into the game, including the aforementioned 5 credit tax to send your pet on a permanent holiday, it was struggling to patch the myriad of gameplay glitches that rendered the Unity client borderline unplayable. Beta testers in the Habbo 2020 test client reportedly flagged over 2,000 bugs prior to its release. As the game developers scrambled to resolve these bugs, Habbo began ditching features left and right. 2-factor authentication and direct messages were being deferred indefinitely. Room moderation tools for non-owners were being eliminated entirely, leading to situations where players were spamming the headquarters of corporations with impunity, demanding payment in order for them to stop. To say that players were upset about the changes would be an understatement, but while players were busy complaining about the update, the markets were busy panicking about it. The black market price for gold bars had already been dropping by September 2020. Market investors who speculated that Habbo was going to announce huge changes to the economy quietly sold off their virtual assets. However, few investors were prepared for the extent to which Habbo was willing to go in order to destroy the black market for good. To understand how these changes would have destroyed the black market, we first have to understand how a typical sale works. When a player wishes to purchase coins illicitly from a seller, either through a Discord marketplace or an auction website, they first transmit their payment to a seller. Once the seller verifies that a purchase has been made, they will trade the buyer a low-valued limited edition rare, an LTD. As the name suggests, LTDs are limited in quantity, and each one has a special ID attached to it. The buyer would be instructed to list that LTD on the marketplace for the specific amount of credits that they have purchased. The seller would then purchase their item back, paying Habbo a 1% marketplace fee in the process. The reason why an LTD is used in the first place, as opposed to an ordinary item, is purely practical. As the marketplace doesn't display the names of its sellers, the unique IDs of every rare, which are shown in the marketplace, allow the seller to easily identify the buyer. By announcing their intention to abolish all user-to-user trades and an introduction of a mandatory 10 to 60% sales tax, Habbo threatened to kill the black market twice over. But the black markets weren't the only ones to be affected by the measures. According to Habbo themselves, user-to-user trade was the driver of over 90% of transactions in the game. Forget the black market, players began to realise that there wasn't going to be an economy left by the time Habbo 2020 launched. So sellers began dumping their assets, selling tens of thousands of dollars worth of virtual currency, rare items, and accounts in a frenzied fire sale. One user dumped 250,000 credits the moment Habbo announced its Habbo 2020 update. Another user, Grasping, sold a similar number of credits for over $7,000. She remarked that had she sold her gold bars before the announcement, she would have been able to sell her credits for over $14,000. Habbo's sudden and seemingly capricious changes to the game, such as the increase in exchange tax and the temporary disabling of the marketplace, only added more panic to the markets. The panic was so pronounced in Habbo Brazil, the community manager felt the need to intervene by giving a media interview, insisting that user-to-user trades weren't being removed but were instead being modified, and that users should calm down about the update. To entice players to return to the game, in January 2021, Habbo released a limited edition rare, the Lavish Perfume, a tax-exempt 750 credit currency item. But instead of purchasing them as a collectible, as Habbo intended, players began using them as a way to engage in tax-free gambling. Soon, reports filtered in of fake casinos being set up by scammers, staffed with alt accounts impersonating well-known, reputable players. Other users, sensing that the end of Habbo was nigh, began cashing in on their hard-earned reputation by pulling off exit scams in the black markets. As an underground industry, buyers and sellers in the black market suffered from a lack of legal protections. Official middlemen, OMMs, were players who acted as escrows between buyers and sellers, holding sold items until sellers confirmed that they received payment from the buyer. Rules differed depending on which market you were in, but in general, players had to cultivate years of trust, making thousands of trades, gathering positive endorsements from other OMMs, and in some cases revealing their own real-life identities before becoming an OMM themselves. Notwithstanding occasional corruption, OMMs provided a crucial lifeline to the black market by providing consumer and business confidence to a market that otherwise offered no legal protections. So when reports surfaced that an OMM had thrown years of community trust under the bus by going on a $7,000 scamming spree, in one case scamming a single user out of $3,000, the markets went into an even greater frenzy. Buyers and sellers were now on their own to avoid a crime wave involving tens of thousands of dollars that was gripping the black market. As one anguished user wrote in mid-November, "The community is killing this game. 3 scammers, 2 weeks, 1 OMM scam." As mentioned at the start of the video, an estimated $30 million was wiped out from the Habbo economy, a figure that doesn't include expenditures from non-Habbo club members. Spending fell by nearly 80% between August 2020 and February 2021. But spending didn't zero out during the market crash. Even by December, when the value of credits effectively halved, Habbo Club members still spent an estimated $5.5 million on goods and services. We've talked about the sellers, so now it's time to talk about the buyers. The crash of the Habbo black market wasn't a disaster for everyone. With exchange rates for credits at unprecedented lows, some players decided to cash in and buy voluminous numbers of virtual currency and assets. One group of these players were known as whales, players who spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars every month on the game. Whales can spend that much money for various reasons. Corporate owners need liquidity to pay for salaries and expand business operations. Fan sites and non-profits need coins to give as handouts to poor, desperate Habbos. Many whales resort to the black market for 2 reasons. Firstly, the black market is simply cheaper. Before the market crash, players were able to buy around 1.5 times as many credits as the official Habbo store. Secondly, the black market has no spending limit. For US players, Habbo imposed a monthly spending limit of $360 a month, and for some players, that isn't enough to cover their monthly in-game expenses. One such player was Giant Eye, the founder of a project called Hab City, a conglomerate of automatically run games and giveaways. According to Giant Eye themselves, Hab City was hemorrhaging money. While it generated around 20,000 credits in revenue from the sale of VIP memberships, it was reportedly spending over 235,000 credits, over $14,000 in the span of just 3 months. So to fund the continued operation and expansion of Hab City, Giant Eye turned to the black market. He claimed that for the month of December 2020 alone, he purchased $3,800 worth of credits. Giant infrastructure projects weren't the only reasons why some players bought into the crash. Another group of players, the collectors, bought in for reasons of nostalgia and prestige. Players were able to fulfill childhood dreams of amassing huge quantities of credits and rares at a fraction of the cost, inducting them into Forbes-style rich lists like the Coin Club, and entering the elite class of the Habbo aristocracy, or what was left of it anyway. The final group of players that bought in were the investors, the players who disagreed with the mainstream consensus that Habbo was intentionally trying to jump off a cliff. For example, one player suggested that Habbo's introduction of one-time payments, like the $6 wealth tax exemption, showed Habbo was trying to squeeze the last pennies out of the game before shutting it down. While many in Habbo agreed with this assessment, a small minority of sources that I spoke to had a different view. They argued that Habbo's intention wasn't to commit economic suicide, it was to enter into negotiations with its player base. Hikes in exchange tax, sales tax, etc. were attempts by Habbo to make an outrageous maximalist bid from the start. By quote-unquote compromising with a more moderate proposal, Habbo would be able to implement the true changes it wanted all along, and its player base would self-congratulate itself for seemingly making Habbo yield. This wasn't Habbo's first rodeo with player protests either. In 2010, when Habbo introduced the exchange tax for the first time, protests broke out. Players threatened to hold a purchase strike, which would have paralysed the economy. In the words of Habbo's lead designer, that strike was busted the moment they launched something cool to buy. That cool thing was VIP status, an upgraded version of the Habbo Club, which included swathes of new clothing choices, twice as many gifts every month, and a limited exemption from the marketplace sales tax. In 2016, when Habbo doubled the monthly cost of Habbo Club membership and forced users to pay real-life money for it, protests broke out again. The introduction of the Habbo Club Payday scheme, which included giving players a number of credits depending on how long they possessed membership, along with a 10% rebate for all in-game purchases, killed off those protests. By buying the dip, the investors took a massive gamble that it will happen again. Habbo would quell the protests, users would come back, and they'd be able to make a handsome profit. On the 16th of January 2021, when Habbo ended user-to-user trading, Quackity raided Habbo with his viewers, encouraging them to protest with #NotMyHabbo. Thousands of players, including veterans, rallied around his banner, demanding it reverse the Habbo 2020 update. Calls for boycotts were emboldened. It was a Habbo 2020 revolution. On the 4th of February, Habbo announced it was reducing marketplace fees. You've made your feelings clear about the current fees paid when selling on the marketplace, particularly in the medium to high range. So based on your feedback, we're going to reduce them significantly. What was previously a 39% sales tax for a 60,000 credit item was now going to be 9.5%. At last, Sulake is coming to terms with how devastating these changes are, judging by the implosion of online users, commented one user. Credit where credit is due, this is a step in the right direction, and the percentage fees associated with the item price are much fairer than before, another commented. 1 week later came the big announcement. We're bringing back Flash. The old marketplace, room moderation tools, and user-to-user trading were being brought back. An economic recovery soon followed, and the price of gold bars and rares on the black market stabilised to pre-crash levels. In March 2021, to entice players to return to the game, Habbo released the Brown Dragon Lamp, a recoloured version of one of its most popular rares, and gave them out for free to every player that logged in that month. But just like the lavish perfume that came before it, players used them in ways that Habbo didn't exactly account for. In this case, a hacker reportedly breached the accounts of around 95,000 inactive players to obtain as many Brown Dragon Lamps as they could. Using a dozen storage accounts, the Brown Dragon Lamps were laundered using a series of trades before ending in the hands of wholesalers, shop owners, and marketplace merchants who were none the wiser. In total, the hacker and their accomplice reportedly made $7,600 from their enterprise, selling a total of 190,000 credits at below market rates. Hindsight is 2020. When I asked Grasping how she felt after selling off 250,000 credits for only $7,000, she admitted she sold off her virtual assets at the absolute minimum price she could have asked for. But she herself had no regrets. I couldn't take a chance on what was essentially most of my real-life net worth, she explained. She wasn't the only one. Source after source I talked to echoed the same sentiments. Selling credits on Habbo was their livelihood. Many of them couldn't take the risk that some investors bet everything on. Habbo has since moved on from the 2020 market crash, gradually regaining the goodwill it lost with its player base. In June 2024, for example, Habbo released Habbo Origins, a 2005 version of the game that cashed in on that old school nostalgia. So while Habbo 2020 didn't bring Habbo to an end, what must end is this video.